now I'm going to let the stage to Folmer Bokma, who is first of all a friend of our project, because it's the third time that Folmer collaborates with us for AppEEL. He is a professor in Umeå University in Sweden, professor in the Department of Ecology and Environmental Sciences. He is a senior researcher and has a lab that investigates the premises of punctuated equilibria theory in the context of neontology. And he is invited in many conferences because he did a pioneering research using computation-intensive analysis of molecular phylogenetics to measure the rate of evolution and to draw conclusion and test the hypothesis of punctuated equilibria, speciation rates, extinction rates, and how fast is evolution and what's the temporal pattern of evolution. So please, Folmer.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for the introduction, and I would like to thank the organizers and the sponsors for this event being here. As you may notice, I made a small change to the title. I realized that many people who are here do not actually work on biological organisms, but on other systems. I will, however, talk mostly on organisms. I will try to draw some parallels to complex systems. Okay, good. There has been some discussion as to how appropriate it is to talk about evolution of other things than biological organisms. And very often the concerns come from, yes, but is there something that relates to the gene? Is there something that is equivalent to selection? So there has been some Darwinization of certain areas, and one might actually argue that perhaps some areas should be de-Darwinized. I think one of the areas that could use some de-Darwinization is evolutionary biology, and I'll try to explain to you why. So, good. Since it is this year 100 years ago that Alfred Russel Wallace passed away, I thought to phrase this a little bit in Wallace's terms rather than in Darwin's. And I thought to start to show you a Florida cormorant. I gave part of this talk earlier at IBS in Florida this year, which is strikingly similar to a great cormorant. I have another example of this. Two gulls, the black-headed gull and the laughing gull. These species look remarkably similar, yet geographically they are very distant. Wallace had like a lot of expertise in biogeography, so we'll give this a biogeographic context. There you have it. These species are far apart, yet look surprisingly similar. Just to give you an idea that this is Florida, where we had a conference, and the other two species are where I'm living, up in northern Sweden. You can also do some swimming there, it's just in somewhat different circumstances. So despite the great difference in where these species are found, they are strikingly similar phenotypically. Now, Wallace phrased this in 1905 in an overview of his work, and he said the problem then was not only how and why do species change, but how and why do they change into new and well-defined species, distinguished from each other in so many ways. Why and how they become so exactly adapted to distinct modes of life, and why do all the intermediate grades die out, as geology shows they have died out, and leave only clearly defined and well-marked species. Yeah, okay, thanks. Only clearly defined and well-marked species, genera, and higher groups of animals. And especially, why are all the intermediate grades not there anymore? Why don't we see a bird somewhere? And we have no idea what it is, because we have never seen a bird of this kind before in this area. No, if I go from Sweden down here, I can still recognize most of these species. Why is that? If they would be so locally adapted, why look they exactly the same as they look up there in northern Sweden with a very different climate? So that's what I want to talk about today. So what determines the mean trait value of a species and what the variance around it? So I think that most evolutionary biologists actually would claim that they know, and I will claim that they don't know. So if we go back to Darwin's finches, for example, I think that most evolutionary biologists would agree with this picture, where you have two species that are fairly similar when they are in allopatry, but when they occur in the same place, you see a shift. We can call it character displacement, limiting similarity, whatever. There are several names for it. And it's a well-established pattern in ecology. That seems to make a lot of sense. But think about the temperature of these species. No, we don't think about, for example, the beak size or the body size anymore. We think about the temperature. And suddenly we realize that these species have exactly the same temperature. Now, if it were so that the beak sizes were different because of intra- and interspecific competition, well, then that would imply that body temperature has no implications for competition. You can perfectly well coexist with exactly the same temperature, right? But that causes two problems. The one is, I would like to have an ecologist who can a priori give me a list of all the traits that have no implication for competition. Yeah, that are fine to coexist even though they're exactly similar. As long as I can't get that a priori, I won't believe it. The other thing is that if it really doesn't matter for fitness, then why is there no variation within the species? Like, you would be 13 degrees, you would be 45, you would be 63. Because if it doesn't matter, then why would there be so little variation within the species? So we have these nice explanations of certain patterns, but then they seem to be extremely specific to one or two traits. So to understand that, I would like to go back approximately 200 years to Georges Cuvier, who showed that mammoths and the Ohio animal, African and Indian elephants, were distinct species, and since some of them are not found anymore, they apparently went extinct. So he established the idea of extinction. I'll get back to extinction later. He did it in 1799. He also was very good in comparative anatomy, and he wrote that today, that means in 1799, comparative anatomy has reached such a point of perfection that after inspecting a single bone, one can often determine the class and sometimes even the genus of the animal to which it belonged. Above all, if that bone belonged to the head or the limbs. This is because the number, direction, and shape of the bones that compose each part of an animal's body are always in a necessary relation to all the other parts, in such a way that, up to a point, one can infer the whole from any one of them, and vice versa. I think most of us would agree with that. He also wrote that if an animal's teeth are such as they must be in order for it to nourish itself with flesh, we can be sure without further examination that the whole system of its digestive organs is appropriate for that kind of food, and that its whole skeleton and locomotive organs, and even its sense organs, are arranged in such a way as to make it skillful at pursuing and catching its prey. For these relations are the necessary conditions of existence of the animal. If things were not so, it would not be able to subsist. So that was back in 1799. Now, let's think about that a bit more. In the 1950s, J.B.S. Haldane wrote that the frequency of the more conspicuous phenotype may be halved in a single day about the study system of Lisbon betularia that he was studying. Yeah, the white moths are very easy to find on certain trees. So, like, selection is strong here. So now, if the change of environment would have been so radical that 10 other independently inherited characters had been subject to the selection of the same intensity, then only half to the power 10, or 1 in 1,024 of the original genotype would have survived. The species would presumably have become extinct. He clarified what he meant. He said, I shall try to make quantitative the fairly obvious statement that natural selection cannot occur with great intensity for a number of characters at once unless they happen to be controlled by the same genes. And what does that mean? Leek van Velen explained that for most organisms, rapid turnover in few genes precludes rapid turnover in the others. A corollary of this is that if an environmental change occurs that necessitates the rather rapid replacement of several genes if a population is to survive, the population becomes extinct. Now, evolutionary biologists massively ignored that because still in 1995, Moto Kimura actually This was posthumously published. He died in 1994, but he still found it necessary to write a brilliant 1.2-page paper in PNAS where he explained that it seems to be widely accepted among biologists that Darwinian selection can act almost without limit as to the number of loci or sites that are simultaneously substituting advantageous alleles. If you pick up a randomly chosen genomics paper nowadays, it seems that people are just totally unaware of this because you can easily read that they find strong selection in more than 100 genes. There seems to be no concern as to whether that is actually possible. So let's compare these two distinct phenotypes. The color of Lisbon betularia, which evidently changed rapidly, and the body temperature of a bird, which apparently didn't change very much for a very, very, very long period of time, tens up to 100 million years. What's different about these? Well, color, you can probably change the color of a moth without impairing any other function. It will probably still do fine. But if you try to change the body temperature of a bird, there's probably a whole lot of proteins inside the organism that do not do very well anymore. So to achieve a change in the temperature, you would presumably need to change very many proteins at the same time in the right direction, not one after the other, because any bird that you would get that would still have like 90% proteins that are not doing very well with the new temperature would be clearly at a selective disadvantage compared to another. So certain characters do change. Look at the two foxes. They're strikingly similar. What is different? Well, the color and presumably the length of the fur to a little degree. But the body temperature is precisely the same in these two species. What about the bears? Same story. Yeah? You take a bear, you dump it on the North Pole and it becomes white, but it's still a bear. Now that is something that is very much like underappreciated by evolutionary biologists. We focus on these things that actually do differ, and then we build our theory on that biased sample of phenotypes that is out there, and we think we understand what is actually going on. So Ernst Mayr already wrote that most species displaying geographic variation vary cleanly only in ecotypic characters affecting primarily size, proportions, and coloration, but show no significant evolutionary departures. Actually, I think it's interesting to think of an analogy. Think of two campers, two backpackers that run into a bear, and they escape from the bear. They're running away. Now, most evolutionary biologists would probably say that they try to run faster than the bear, but that's not what they're doing. They're only competing against each other. You only have to run faster than the other. It doesn't matter how fast the bear runs. That's what's going on out there. So I would say that the same goes here. Like we see differences, and if you pick up a guide to ornithology, it will precisely explain you the very tiny differences between those species that will allow you to distinguish them as distinct species. And the funny thing is that works almost everywhere, no matter where you encounter the species. Yeah? But they're still strikingly similar. Good, so then I want to introduce you to another person, Hugh Falconer. Hugh Falconer went to the same university as Darwin did, and it's not known whether they knew each other, but they were there at the same time. Hugh Falconer was a medical doctor, but especially also paleontologist, working for the British Army in India. And he studied, just like Georges Cuvier did, fossil elephants. And when then Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace presented their ideas on evolution, then Hugh Falconer was among those people who actually understood what it was all about. And he wrote a letter to Darwin. He clearly liked the general idea, but he wrote, "I'm bringing out a heavy memoir on elephants, an omnium gatherum affair, with observations on the fossil and recent species. One section is devoted to the persistence in time of the specific characters of the mammoth. I trace him from before the glacial period, through it and after it, unchangeable and unchanged, so far as the organs of digestion and locomotion are concerned." Now, like we heard that before, yeah? The organs of digestion and locomotion in elephants. Now, the glacial period was no joke. It would have made ducks and drakes of your dear pigeons and doves, like he knew that Darwin was fond of pigeons and doves, so he makes a joke here. It's particularly interesting to see Darwin's reply to this letter. He says, "You speak of those animals as having been exposed to vast range of climatal changes from before to after the glacial period. I should have thought, from analogy of seashells, that by migration, Are local extinction by migration not possible? These animals might and would have kept under nearly the same climate. So it's interesting, here you have the person who came up with the idea of evolution, and he says, well, why would they adapt? They can migrate. Now this is something that is still relevant today. In 1991, Tony Bradshaw picked up on this in his Croonian lecture to the Royal Society, and he said, well, we take these migrations for granted because we have so much evidence for that. But there is an alternative. They could actually adapt and change. But he says we have no evidence for that. There is very little evidence that species actually adapt to climate change. Johan Mirla picked up on that a couple of years ago, presenting a meta-analysis of like the species' reaction to climate change. We have almost no evidence for like evolutionary adaptation in reaction to climate change. A lot of phenotypic plasticity, a lot of migration. Douglas Futuima wrote an essay in Evolution 3 years ago, saying that after 150 years, we still do not manage to predict whether a species will actually adapt to climate change or go extinct. We've spent quite some tax money in the meantime. So finally, anyway, like Darwin does admit that Falconer's patterns may be real. He said it's a more important consideration, clearly leading to the same result, as lately insisted on by Dr. Falconer, namely that the periods during which species have been undergoing modification, though very long as measured by years, have probably been short in comparison with the periods during which these same species remained without undergoing any change. Now that reminds us of punctuated equilibria. I want to say a few words about that. So you're probably familiar with the idea of like whether evolution is gradual or whether it is more of a punctuational, whether change is concentrated in speciation events. Falconer claimed it was concentrated in these speciation events. Now to distinguish those, I think we need a modal where there's both. So here you have just branching Brownian motion. You have heard some things before about that, with rapid jumps when you get a new species. Now, in order to parameterize this model, to estimate the parameters, I made this Bayesian system where essentially what we do, we take a phylogeny, estimate the speciation extinction rates using those and some math. We come up with a prior distribution for the number of speciation events that have been pruned by extinction from the tree, all through the tree. Then we take like just phenotypic data, for example, body mass, and then we like implement this model, we update it all in a Bayesian fashion. I will save you the math if you want to know it. Just ask me afterwards or check it out, it's published. So then we pick these nice large phylogenies, like here you have one for mammals and you have one for birds, and then we set to work. Now, first a simple one. Let's assume that there are no jumps. Let's assume that there's just branching Brownian motion, nothing special happens during speciation. Well, then it's fairly easy to get a posterior distribution for the rate of Brownian motion. This would be like 6,000 average body masses for birds. You just get an estimate. But then, when you allow for these like jumps, you get a two-dimensional posterior. So actually, like now your rate of gradual change is here instead of there, so it becomes pretty much smaller. And you also get like you ascribe some evolutionary change to speciation events. So we have little of an option to check whether that is actually correct, but one thing we can do is we can look at subspecies, because they should represent an ongoing or very recent speciation event. And when we do that, actually, it turns out that they exactly fit our estimate. So the black line is not fitted to the red line. These are independent observations, like independent estimates, and they precisely coincide. So the amount of evolutionary change that we estimate from the species-level phylogeny fits perfectly well to the distribution of present-day subspecies out there. They're approximately 20% different in body size on average. Now, fine, why would we care about that? Well, we can do the same thing for mammals. Yeah? Now, mammals, if we think that everything is gradual, then they seem to evolve way faster than birds do, and certainly, like mammals, are known for evolving very rapidly. But if we also take into account that they can change during speciation, then actually the estimates become very similar to those for birds. Actually, they coincide. We can hardly distinguish them. And if we look at subspecies, these are actually very recent species. That seems to be the same as what's going on in birds. So that gets us back to Wallace's question. Why are these species then so clearly defined, and why are all the intermediate grades not there anymore? Why is change also concentrated in speciation events to some degree? And why is the change at speciation, like in birds and mammals, why is it equally large? They're in the same environment. Birds, like they go extinct and speciate more often. You would expect that then just the change at every speciation event would be a bit smaller because they need to adapt to the same environment, right? But that doesn't seem to be the case. The change is just like independent of what anything else is doing out there. It's just like about 20% each time it happens. So that suggests that the natural environment has very little to do with it. What seems to be driving this change is what Cuvier explained. It's the other traits. Yeah? You have a lot of traits that are co-adapted to each other, and you cannot select one of them without having repercussions also on the others, except when that one trait is like color or something. But if it is a trait that actually matters for the other traits, what you get will be tension in the system. Bob May explored these kind of things in the terms of food webs, these kind of interacting systems, and what they do when you put a lot of strain on it, they can rapidly cascade into another state, or they can just completely break up, but they're not going to gradually change over time. So a few take-home messages. Traits of biological organisms form co-adapted complexes. This is, for example, a wiring diagram showing guest relation in sea urchin. It's approximately that complex out there. This co-adaptation dramatically reduces the potential for adaptive evolution, and natural selection cannot act very effectively on many characters at once. So not all characters are equally susceptible to this. Some can actually evolve. And we would really need some models to take that into account if we want to make meaningful predictions about what is going to happen under climate change. Because that polar bear there, it's going to go extinct. We're too late for that one. So now about general systems, like biological organisms are not the only like complex systems of interacting traits. You have a lot of like human systems, culture, grammar, language, law, political systems that also are built up of interacting components. And like these also do not show a pattern of gradual change over time. Scientific revolutions, punctuated equilibria, political revolutions seem to be the norm rather than the exception. So I think that this pattern is much more broad. Then finally, perhaps in 1 minute, I can say something about like the things that we could do. So Darwin came up with a tree. Utni Yule modeled it mathematically to see like the distribution of species over different clades. Why, for example, are there 350 species of primates but only 2 colugos? So he came up with the geometric distribution for this based on a birth-death model, not based on a birth model, as almost all recent literature claims he did. He worked with birth-death models. You should read all the pages of his paper. Anyway, Kendall explicitly put in the extinction rate, and he came to the conclusion that it is still a geometric distribution, which actually Yule had shown already earlier. And then we can put in mass extinctions, like there have been plenty of those in the history, and model those. But then we have like density dependence, ecological opportunity. There's a wealth of recent papers about like all the things that might be going on in nature out there, and how that would affect the distribution of species over taxa, the branching patterns of phylogenies. But can we say anything meaningful about this? Like, are there any general patterns? Well, I would like to introduce this idea of like, given that the system is incredibly complex, it is presumably going to be close to a state of full random mixing. Then, to physicists, mathematicians, it probably would mean maximum entropy. Give it a try. So what we did is actually we tried to derive maximum entropy distributions for the distribution, maximum entropy predictions for the distributions of species over taxa. And this is then what it looks like. Here you see the distribution of species over taxa from am I out of time? Okay, I'll skip this, just I don't want to ask me after it later. It fits nicely, and it fits very many like non-biological distributions as well. This is the wealth of people, like in terms of millions on their bank account, the size of US cities, the numbers of last names, the frequency of links in a network. And so actually, even though the world out there may be very complex, we may actually find methods to describe it that allow us to be more general rather than less general. And that's where I should definitely stop.
Thank you very much.